Hello there everyone, I hope you are all keeping well, inshallah. This video is the first video representation for your lecture series in British literature. The first lecture that we are dealing with begins with an introduction to the Anglo-Saxon period, or say the Old English period, where we'll be discussing the beginnings of English as a language and the beginning of literature as the first account or literary account ever written in England. In this video, I'll try to speak about the Anglo-Saxon literature by emphasizing the historical, social, and the literary backgrounds of the era that starts from 500 to 1066, the year when William of Normandy conquers Britain. Speaking about the Middle Ages here does not only mean the medieval ages where the Norman conquest conquered England. It designates the time span roughly from the collapse of the Roman Empire in 410 AD to the Renaissance and Reformation, meaning the 15th century. So the adjective here, medieval, coined from Latin medium, refers to what was written, made, thought of during that period of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is a period that lasted for 800 years. The invasion of the famous Germanic tribes, namely the Anglo-Saxon and the Jutes, was distant because the Roman Empire and the last remaining Roman legions left the British Isles towards Rome. They were afraid that the new Germanic invaders will invade Rome, but unfortunately for Britannia, those tribes redirected their ships towards the land. The Anglo-land, that is today known as England, was mostly dominated by the Angles as the domineering tribe, because of both the Jutes and the Saxons were the small minority amongst the Angles. They were incorporated within the other dominant and domineering population. When they came to England, they lacked written language and they couldn't either read or write. So they were only establishing an agricultural society that was based on both farming and hunting. And they believed in multiple gods, in maybe animals they used to worship, in idols they shaped, engraved with their hands, or in some supernatural creatures that believed they existed at the time. As far as the Anglo-Saxon language is concerned, the text were mainly written in Old English and in the runic alphabet. The runic alphabet is a system of alphabets that were engraved on stones and on parchment paper. These runic characters were used to maybe practice witchcraft and magic back then. They have also a relationship with some symbolic gods that these Anglo-Saxons used to worship. Old English as a language was not unified because the manuscripts were written in different dialects. The dialects were reflecting the main leading provinces of the time, mainly Kent, West Saxon, Mercia and Northumbria, that were the most strong towns in the Saxon England. Here I want to refer to the pre- and post-Anglo-Saxon arrival and invasion in England by introducing a timeline. This timeline speaks about or shows us the Celts as being the first inhabitants in Britain. The Celts are also referred to as the Britons. When the Roman Empire invaded in 43 AD, they have either enslaved these Celts or driven them westwards to Wales. The Roman invasion left the British Isles in 410 because they thought that it would be preferable to go and protect Rome. They were summoned to go and serve their fallen Roman Empire. Unfortunately for the Britons at the time, or the remaining Britons, the Anglo-Saxons considered the land as an easy prey to raid. The Anglo-Saxons invaded and settled in Britannia by 450 AD. The reign of King Arthur of Wessex is included here because King Arthur was claimed to be a Briton who was fighting against the Anglo-Saxons to free his land. King Arthur is of course a myth that British people and the Western culture like to believe. We don't know if he really existed or not, but historians claim lately that they have found something related to his castle and to his time of reign. Saint Augustine's Christian mission began in 597 when the Pope of Rome sent Augustine to spread Christianity or bring Christianity to the pagan British Isles. Here, Britain started to be Christianized, but unfortunately it was newly raided by new tribes from Central Europe known as the Vikings. The Vikings settled in England from 793 or 5 to 1042. But they were eventually defeated by an Anglo-Saxon king, Alfred, who forced them to sign a truce and convert to Christianity. The Anglo-Saxon lifestyle, culture and society came mostly into an end by the coming of the Normans to England in 1066 by killing the last Saxon king, Howard, in the Battle of Hastings, and sitting on the English throne. William of Normandy became the new king of England. This William of Normandy brought with him a new culture, new languages, and a new tradition that meant to cultivate, educate, and civilize the barbaric Britannia. When the missionaries came to re-establish Christianity in England, they didn't only bring with them new ways of behavior and practicing religion, but they also introduced Latin to be the official scholarly language. The runic Old English tongue was considered vernacular and colloquial. I want to refer to something that I have found rather alluring concerning Christianity and the way it was established in England. In 731, a historian by the name of Bede, who was a Briton and who wrote the history of the English people, introduced someone in the manuscript known as Hadrian the African, and in Latin he was considered vir natione Afir, a man of African race. This Hadrian the African was claimed to be a Berber or Amazigh, and he was the leading light in one of the most significant cultural movements that took place 1400 years ago. This Hadrian the African was originally from Libya and mainly from Benghazi. He was born in North Africa but spent the rest of his life in England, and he is known to us by the name of Abbot Hadrian the African. On the right here you see an archaeological site of his birthplace that was excavated lately. When England was still semi-pagan, because maybe Christianity was not introduced to the entire land, Hadrian and his friend Theodore came carrying with them manuscripts and maybe books that were religious mainly, and they helped reviving the learning that was stalled since St. Augustine's first mission in 597. Hadrian and his friend Theodore fled from Libya and Syria respectively, and it is claimed that they have escaped from the Arab rule and the Arab newcomers at the time. So in their first settlement in Naples, Italy, they were asked to travel to Britain to go and teach people new teachings, new dimensions, practices of this Christian tradition. Michael Wood considers that Michael Wood, who is a British historian, when writing his article in October 2020, he said that English culture's roots came from 4 great strands: the wisdom of Greece and Rome, the Hebrew tradition, and the light that came out of Africa. Social and literary context in Old English literature go hand in hand, because everything that was practiced and behaved in society was generally reflected in the literary writings and manuscripts. The idea of Christian religion here had an appreciable significance and influence on the development of medieval Old English literature. It started to be written mainly in monasteries and in courts, because poets who were known at the time by the name of scops or shops were writing to favor the king and to praise the king. And also monks were writing in churches and monasteries, and they were describing the cultural and social tradition of the time. Christian monks and nuns were considered the guardians of culture because they were the only ones to read and write. And mainly, Anglo-Saxon literature started to be expressed in the runic writings, in Old English writings and runic characters, before being later Latinized. Speaking about society and history will lead us to speak about the heroic versus the Christian culture. Heroism was originated in the tribal tradition that was brought by the Germanic tribes. Christian culture and tradition was, of course, introduced by the missionaries that introduced religion to England. So a great deal of literary material was passed orally and transmitted by spoken form, and it wasn't written until the end of the 8th century, or maybe the 7th or the 8th century. Pagan tribal societies at the time were unable to write, and so they were transmitting their stories, poems, through oratory. Old English literature was mainly rooted in its oratory. And when the Anglo-Saxons arrived from Denmark, from Germany, the Netherlands, they brought with them the stories of legendary heroes. So the cultural identity or identity remained hybrid, because we don't have something that was original to it. Britons were driven westwards, and so the Germanic tribes introduced their tradition and their behavior and practices, and mainly heroic tales and culture. Documenting Anglo-Saxon literature by Christian monks forged and brought together new deeper meanings into the texts. For example, a Saxon text or a Germanic text was referring to not only to the heroic culture that was pagan in origin, but it also embellished that foreign Germanic culture with religious dimensions, and interwove two opposing aspects of earthly and heavenly values to define man's importance and role in life. We have here, for example, an extract from a poem called The Battle of Maldon from 991 AD that reads, "The mind must be the tougher, the heart the keener, the courage must be greater as our strength diminishes." It describes heroic, legendary courage that was supposed to be brought or known in a warrior. The Battle of Maldon, of course, describes the way the Anglo-Saxons fought against the Vikings in the 9th century. The heroic epic tradition was Christianized when put into writing, means that the religious monks that were writing in monasteries mainly added some Christian values and dimensions to the heroic aspects of texts and stories. So battles, triumphs and defeats were for the Anglo-Saxons a style of life. Man adopted that and grew at emulating and imitating. The events that were found in those texts reflected the literature of the period. And the tribal societal code governing any hero was a code of behavior that shaped the warrior into becoming a good warrior. The tribal code referred to the aspect of heroism that was supposed to be shown by the hero. The hero needed to be physically strong, showing courage and prowess, and by being gallant, strong and proud, the hero would be copied and envied, and he will present a tribal honor to his family and his society. Any warrior in the Anglo-Saxon society was proven valiant and skillful in the battlefield or at war in general Once he could defend the tribe and save the ones who counted on him. All these societal norms and cultural aspects were all depicted in the literature of the time. The code of honor that the Anglo-Saxon pagan culture cherished lived in the idea of weird. Weird here refers to what we know today as fate or destiny. According to them, man is destined to die in battle, and in dying in battle, any warrior would consummate this kind of code of honor, where he will show a moral obligation towards the family, society, and more importantly, towards the sovereign of the tribe and the fellow men, and who will prove himself to be an epic warrior. Because there was a kind of blood liaison of brotherhood between this Saxon warrior and between his fellow men. According to the Germanic tradition, man cannot survive alone. So in a warrior society, warfare in life or in that society was everything to them, and being a warrior was already a lifestyle. The epic warrior was archetyped into a literary hero that we see in literary writings, and he was considered the pride of a nation. So every Anglo-Saxon tribe or family had a warrior chief, who in turn showed loyalty to a royal noble or landlord. Warlords were usually kings. Kings back then were showing their skillfulness in battle and their bravery and gallantry through fighting in the battlefield. So the king, along with the group, formed a close connection, a kit that was called a comitatus. Comitatus is a cluster of warriors with their king that would give the warrior strength and honor and a model to emulate and imitate. The Old English literature represented a kind of oscillation. Oscillation is a fluctuation. It is to go and come back and forth between two things or two sides, between what is material and what is spiritual. And this binary opposition between the two sides would also reflect the aspect of man and God, vice and virtue, and highlight the nature of a human being, the outer and the inner aspects where he is distorted between the godly obligations and the earthly pleasures. So literature at the time was a representation of interlaced narratives. The interrelation or the intertextuality in narratives were reflected in the heroic tradition that was connected more or less with the earthly power, wealth, and pleasure, and with the religious, spiritual dimensions that were divine. So these interlaced narratives represented heroism and also sermons of religious discourse and approval of human behavior, where moral and religious matters were both addressed and stressed. Man has to be torn between this worldly existence and the divine unseen life. He needs, in this regard, to satisfy the earthly needs and submit to God's commandments. So, in respecting these divine commandments and orders, man tailors his terrestrial life accordingly, because he knows that he is bound to conform to certain practices and meet certain expectations in society and through his behavior. I wish here to refer to the idea of women in the Anglo-Saxon society. The woman during the Old English period was seen to be insignificant because she was considered weak and she was only destined to bear children and take care of them and of her tribe. So she was only allowed to perform social roles at court or in that tribe. In the Christian tradition, for example, females were depicted to be biblical heroines showing piety and righteousness. But in the heroic tradition, they symbolized frightening female monstrosity, similar to Medusa, who was a mythical creature, female, with snakes on her head, and she would transform the ones looking at her into stones. This is all for now. I hope you find this useful. If you have any question, please leave it in the comment section below or contact me in my email address. Keep safe.